All right, I think we have most of the people we're expecting. So welcome everyone to our May Crane webinar. Just some logistics before we get started. We'd really love to know where all of you are calling from and what group you're representing. So if you can edit your name to include your first and last name and the company that you're representing, if you are representing one, that would be great. We are recording this webinar, so that will be made available on our YouTube channel after the event, and we'll email it out to anyone who is RSVP to the event as well. And you can submit any questions in the Q&A as they come up during the webinar, and we'll do our best to either answer them directly or at the end during our Q&A session. So just an introduction, if you've interacted with us in person at all, you will most likely run into myself, Seth, and Amber. I'm Cassie Borish. I'm one of the data scientists at Rho AI. Seth is our director of impact analytics, and Amber is a fellow data scientist who helps lead the software development for Crane. In terms of things that have happened since our last webinar in April, we have literally, like as of yesterday, just released our new custom technologies module, which Seth will be showcasing today. This module originates from a separate app that we had previously used with our Crane fellows, so that internally they could input data for the original technology templates that we provided when we first released the tool. And then as we had interacted with our users, we quickly realized that this would actually be a useful functionality for our users at large, since it's impossible for us to anticipate all of the potential emerging technologies and use cases that our users would want to assess. So this opens a large customization capability for our users. Also in the works is a user report, which we're planning to release later this summer. And this is based off of what our users have experienced over the past year since Crane's release. And we are still accepting input to our user survey, which I've pasted the link in the slides, and maybe Amber or Seth can paste it in the chat. So if you haven't filled it out already, we are still accepting responses, and we would greatly appreciate it if you take about 10 minutes to fill it out. It is not intended to be limited just to Crane users, but really we're looking for anyone who is even just thinking about forward-looking emissions assessments, so that we can get a better understanding of what are some of the outstanding gaps in this area and where can we best tailor the tool to meet those needs. It is also an opportunity to provide input on where we should focus our near-term development. And so far what we're seeing is that our users are looking for a more expansive technology database. So if you agree or disagree with that, you can answer that in our survey. With that, I will pass things over to Seth so he can give you a showcase of our custom technologies module.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cassie. Hey, everybody. Let me just share my screen really quick. Spotlight it. And there we go. So can you all see it? Okay. Let me get a really quick view of my messy desktop. At least it's a nice picture. Oh yeah. So one thing. So I'm Seth. I think I've probably talked to a few of you at some point, but just glad to be able to take the opportunity to show the amazing work that my colleagues have pulled together here, and just wanted to thank you too for attending today. One thing I like to do prior to kind of introducing some of these some of these tools, because we're still working on some of our own terminology, and to be honest, I think the whole research space is kind of figuring things out, in terms of just even the vernacular around it. So the distinction I'd want to make just in advance is between model templates and analyses. So an analysis is something that you can do in the main app. So when you click on ERP assessment, or if you start here, that it just brings you to this page. And this is where you can explore model templates. And then once you start an analysis, you can further customize it to fit your specific case using the kind of guidance that we have in there. So that's running an analysis where you can put in, if you want to, company-specific data around performance or expectations about market penetration, that sort of thing. So that's the main app. The model templates are something that we put together in order to support analyses. So there's not really a limit to the number of model templates that we would want to have. There is a limit to how many we could practically provide. Right now, there are 205, and then there are several, probably 20 or 30 or so, that are user submitted and going through the Crane verification process right now in order to be public and available to everybody. And shout out to Mars Discovery District for collaborating with us on through their Mission from Mars challenge in order to bring those model templates together. So those are going to be available soon. But the model templates are really an opportunity to build out something that's more generalized that can be used for lots of different companies or a few different kind of cases, 2 to 3, up to 10, usually, if there are that many who are competing and providing very, very similar products with a similar kind of market focus and who have a similar kind of theory of impact for their technology, like the mechanism of avoiding carbon. So I'm going to be focusing on the view technologies slide here, and this is the custom technologies module, another way of saying it. But this is essentially where you can customize either by riffing on existing models, which is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to copy one of the public models or create a sort of clone version and then just walk you through a few of the different tabs and kind of explain them as best I can on this call. So as Cassie had mentioned, the sort of origin of this was an admin tool that we had designed and put together in order to support the Crane Research Fellows who we've worked with and continue to work with through time to build out these templates, model templates. And they needed a place to put the data that they were finding. Once they cleaned it up and got it into a Crane format, they needed a stable kind of database to interact with and something kind of an endpoint to enter the data that can be, as I'm sure everybody on the call knows, quite messy from the outset. So it's like a goal, and from there, Crane can easily ingest it, including everything from the references, which I'll show you, to the, let me close this box because you're probably kind of blocking, to the from references to the actual data to even notes on model limitations, et cetera. So it's sort of a super user way of approaching this. You have to, with the custom technology module, unless you're starting from scratch, which is obviously pretty common for us when we're building out new ones, you can, as I said, you can clone existing models and modify them further using some of the same market related data, emissions projections, all of that kind of stuff, which I'll show you how to do in here. And then what you can do from there is you can submit it, and by submitting it, it gets ingested into Crane so that you can use it. You could use it and kind of play around with it. And the templates that you make don't have to be public at all. The default setting, and I'll show you the sharing rights in a few minutes. They're private by default. You can make them public as kind of draft models if you want to share within your kind of industry or more easily share with other people. As you're building out the custom technology templates, the model templates, you'll probably want to avoid putting in confidential or proprietary data. But you don't have to. If you want to keep the model private and you want to only share it with folks within your organization, it's totally fine to do that. It's secure in the sort of Crane vault, and it's really designed to protect information like that, because sometimes you have to use specific performance metrics or goals or your own sort of purchase data for estimates around market potential and all that. So So we give you kind of both options. So without further ado, I'll just dive into one of these. I had one in mind, so I'll search. So just to give you kind of a lay of the land here, the green tab is a set of user submitted, but not Crane verified, which means that they haven't gone through the final step of review by us, by Rho AI, to determine that they meet all of our standards and documentation and rigor yet. So it's just sort of a backlog of ones that we expect to make public at some point in time, and very likely will. So kind of an exciting backlog to get through here. These are still, several of these are still going through a peer review process, even prior to our look at it. So they're kind of in this sort of limbo until they get to the verified Crane technology state. If you're making your own, they're probably going to be in either draft mode, or which is where you can interact with it, or they'll be in user submitted, which is where they're kind of locked into Crane. You can unsubmit them and then get them back into kind of draft form to further modify them. But anyway, that was just kind of a side note on the what the status means. And there are different ways you can get used to as you're kind of building these out, how to use them. The verified Crane technologies, these, as I mentioned, are ones that have gone through the final review process. And these are ones that actually appear. So like appliance management, for instance, these appear in the main app. So if I type in appliance, it should pop up. Yeah, so it's that one. And these are fully public vetted generalized models that you can use and work with. If it doesn't meet the sort of standard that you're looking for in terms of either documentation or specificity to your own product, or if you feel like it just isn't quite getting the mechanism right, or it's not fully catching the value proposition from a climate from a carbon avoidance standpoint, then this is where you want to be. So you can interact with these in a couple of different ways. If they're your models and you're the owner of it, you can click on the edit button. If they're not, then you can copy them. You just clone them. So we have our original creators here. Once I click this, it'll duplicate it, and it'll open up the custom technology fields. And so now that it's done that, I'm just going to go ahead and call this version 2 webinar, and then save it. So now I'm going to be creating one. It'll show up in the green section that I had showed you before of draft and user submitted models. So I can search for it there if I want to continue editing at a later time. So I'm just going to go through each one of these tabs and show you some of the functionality. And then I'll sort of leave it to you all to continue exploring, to ask questions, and to get into the greater detail as needed at a future time. I also want to leave a lot of time for questions, and if you want to get into the weeds, after I give the walkthrough, it'll be a good chance to do that. So the way that we have this laid out, it subdivides each of the major kind of sections for data that are needed into several tabs. And you can see we've got 4 or 5, about seven tabs. You don't have to fill all of them out. There are a few that are essential, namely target market and total market, and then technology details. So these are pretty open-ended. Once you've cloned one of these, and if you're obviously in the custom technology template and you can see it's draft already, you can start making your changes. Just make sure you save them as they go. We don't have an auto save feature implemented yet, so it's a good idea to do that. So I'll just walk you through some of the sections. So technology details. So you can see. So technology details is where you're going to be putting in all of the descriptive information. And we have helper text under each one of these, so I won't bore you with the specifics on each tab. But these are generally divided up so that you can come back to them, think about each one of them independently, and collect the data you need, and then come back to Crane when you have what you need in terms of documentation or more information. So you can put in whatever name you want for the technology name. And sometimes these have to be specific. I'm not actually sure, and I'll probably leave this one to Amber or Cassie to answer what the rules are at the moment in terms of our implementation here around similar names across multiple users. So kind of saving with a similar name, but owned by multiple people. I'm not sure how we're handling that at the moment. So it's a good idea to have as unique a name as you can in this one. And there are some character limits.
Yeah, I can type in, we don't allow this identical duplicate names. So they can be similar, but if you have the exact same name, then you will get an error when you try to ingest it into the database.
Thanks, Amber. So that's kind of what we're working with now. These really shouldn't be too vague in any case. There are some good appliance management is one of the more vague ones. And actually, I'm gonna go back because this isn't the one I want to show you. I'm just like fell right into it while going through. I wanted to show you the lithium sulfur battery electric vehicles. I like this model because it's fairly intuitive. Okay, so actually, I won't call this one version 2 as well. I'm just going to save the progress here. Okay, so this is where you can put in your name. Sufficient specificity that you can find it, that it works for your purposes. And if you do plan on giving it to the public, the generalized model, which we encourage you to do, and thank you in advance for doing, having a nice, succinct but also descriptive name is really important. So I won't belabor that point anymore. You can select at least one category, but you can select multiple if you want that you think that it belongs to. That will add it to make it accessible through the category tiles that you see in the ERP assessment, the main app. We try not to be too kind of hierarchical or establish too many kind of taxonomies or relationships in that way with naming, just because I mean, for a lot of reasons, but one of them is just that sometimes the same technology can be used in different contexts, and there can be so much overlap between technologies, in terms of the markets or where it fits. It could be manufacturing, but manufacturing for a specific, I don't know, for a specific like electricity sector or some other specific sector. So we try not to be too prescriptive there, but you can select one here, which we encourage you to do at a kind of top level, kind of thematic categorization. Then you can come down here and enter a description. This is the first area on the page where you can see this little icon. So if you click on this, you can see where to put references. So if you're directly quoting or you're sort of cribbing from someone else's description, or you have elements in here that are have already been succinctly summarized by somewhere else, and you want to put them into this field, the right way to do that, the right way to reference it, the sort of preferred way to reference it here and in a number of other spaces where you're actually putting in data, not just text, is by using this references tab. This is the way within Crane, for those who are familiar and have used the tool, this is the way that we organize and show references automatically within the output report and do the footnotes as tied to specific sections. So there's not magic there, except a really deep commitment to making sure that we're providing that line of sight, and then obviously putting in the work to implement it in code. So just to demystify that a little bit, this is where you can keep track of that down to whatever level of specificity you want. If it's a page number and specific figure, definitely put it in, because it makes it a lot easier to audit the output report when the time comes. If you want to do that, you don't have to add references. And if I were to delete this, as I'll show you, I think in a later example, this will change color to be, I think, yellow, and that's a signifier that it's missing a reference. So you can also add notes here. These notes do not show up in the output materials or in the app itself. These are just background. So if you need to kind of put breadcrumbs for yourself or further explain a calculation, you can add those here. Let's see. Another feature which I just want to highlight here. This one doesn't have. This is an older model, so this actually predates our use of background notes. You can upload Excel files and there's a link here to a template with an example. I won't click on it now because I'm not sure what it's going to do to my tabs. So I'll just leave you to click on that. But this is where you can kind of fill out this template kind of offline, and as well as add any additional kind of calculations that are relevant to your analysis. Any unit, dimensional translations, any kind of unit conversion, any of that kind of stuff you can do in an Excel file document anywhere where it needs to be more open-ended in order to accommodate the structure and quality and content that you want to bring in terms of the raw data. You can do in a background notes, and this is an Excel file type. Then you can upload it, save it, and then you'll have those background notes available as you run through. There's no integration by design between the Excel file fields and these tabs. It's more like a sheet from which you can copy and paste information into the tool as you're going and add additional detail as needed. So that's a new feature that we've added. You can select a geography. We have all the countries as well as some regions as well as global that you can select from. We don't have the ability to make this even more specific than that on the fly, but this list. So if you want to, message us through Slack or through info@cranetool.org, we can add more for your convenience. Sometimes we get it to, specific to states or specific, sub-regions, and that's just a way to ensure that it's working for you all. So yeah, just email us with that if you need it. Keyword tags. These will allow you to search more quickly within the main ERP assessment, the main Crane app. And you can add, we encourage you to add 3 or 4 usually for others. You don't have to use this field. It is really handy when you're trying to find your old work, or again, if you want to share with the wider community. This is a nice thing to have. And we've got also examples. You'll see this in the custom technology, this module as well, where we just have these little kind of pop-ups. So if you need more guidance on what the good examples are versus bad examples or not so good examples for whatever the field is, how to fill out the specific field, you can do that. We try not to be too prescriptive with a lot of this stuff, just because people's imaginations and their expertise are collectively so much more robust than any of us individually or even as a small group can imagine. So feel free to try to break it, honestly, to whatever degree you want. And if you do break it, let us know. So there's the examples too. And then lastly, if you want to fill out the known limitations section, this is nice background material. This can be interpreted in one of 2 ways, or both if you just want to add notes. This is a kind of more sort of in your face field for you to fill out if there are known sort of problems or data limitations or whatever that you want to highlight for you, for your future self, or for any of your colleagues or anybody, any sort of third-party auditors coming through. Where do they need to be looking in terms of improving the quality of the data, investigating further, so on and so forth. So it's something that you can say about either limitations in terms of the data, limitations in terms of the kind of analytical approach that you decided to take as you define these other tabs. It's also a place to add notes for future improvements and any kind of assumptions that you've made that you want to highlight, kind of internal to the model template. So that's the description field, and you get this is a pretty important one because it shows up on quite a lot of the Crane app, and it's all descriptive at this point. But writing these in a kind of tight way is we found it to be very useful and very important for others as they're trying to get through and get to a quick understanding of the technology first and foremost, and why there's a potential benefit for the climate. So that's technology details tab. don't worry. I don't think it's going to take me quite as long to get through each of the other tabs. So I'll just roll through these because the structure of several of them is very similar. So total market, target market, established market, skip over performance metrics for a moment, and then related market are distinct, all market and emissions oriented tabs. The ones that you will likely use the most are total market and target market. Total market is referring to the TAM. And what you want to do is, ideally you'd have some of your own even better data than what we're providing in here. But if you want to search and you're not interested in using what you just cloned for this one, in terms of the market size and the emissions, direct and indirect, as you decide to define them in here. If you want to search around, use something else, you can use this feature. So this will actually search through all of our market information. So you could even, if you wanted to, pull in markets that were totally irrelevant to this solution. I'm not going to do that because it would break things. Just hit the search tool, and you can see what transportation related market and emissions data we have for each one of these. So just to, I think transportation was the one. Maybe I typed in vehicle last time. Let's see what we get with vehicle. Yeah, so we've got quite a bit here. So what you can see is what the projection scenario is, what data we have, and from which projection scenarios, what data sources, what geographies are relevant to it, what the functional units are that we're currently using, and each one of these has the quantification of the market size and then the projections out through 2060 generally, or it's interpolated to 2060. And it has the emissions that are associated with that. And there'll be background notes on how the emissions were estimated. By and large, as I mentioned in previous webinars, we'll be getting the sector projections, the market scale projections, industry scale projections, all of that from the same models that provide us with the emissions estimates. So that there's a pretty short distance between those two sort of data points for each year. And so if I were to click on one of these, and it will automatically fill out all of the fields below it. I'm not going to do that just because I just sort of interrupt my flow. So yeah, so that's a useful tool, we think, and our fellows have found it to be useful. So I imagine hopefully some folks here will find that useful as well. And then there's, you can name it, give it a more specific name. You can rephrase it in some way. Again, there are some examples, but these are really more like guidance. This one's funny because the good and the bad are identical. Not sure what happened there. That's just like inevitable. They give a webinar and it's like, oh, this is a bug.
They're not identical. It's the gross versus global. So we don't include the geography in the name of this. So it's just some small nuances and then like the capitalization, I think.
Oh my goodness, thank you, Amber.
Small nuances, but to remain consistent with the rest of the database.
The embarrassing thing is I think I might have written these like these two, but anyway, thank you. Yeah, definitely nuance. So there are some nuances as just very efficiently demonstrated live. So anyway, so that was a funny example. And then this is where you can add more information if more description is necessary. This one doesn't appear in the app. This is more background info. And sometimes if it doesn't, if the name of the total available market just doesn't fully capture what you want to be showing, then this is a good place to put more information. This one, incidentally, I think we should update in order to, by our own sort of guidance, eliminate the geography that's listed, which I will do at some point in the future. So let's see, just scrolling down here, there's another one of these. So you can see this one is that kind of yellow orange color, which just means that it's a signal that there's no reference for this one. And this is an important one to include a reference for the market projection scenario. So we'll highlight those. There are a space for market size units. You can search existing ones. And if you search and select an existing one, it'll fill out both of these. You can also define your own here. These abbreviations appear in quite a few of the graphs and in the main app, as well as throughout this technology module, and the full units appear in a few other cases, but these are used often, so important to get right. And this is just as an aside, this is one of the areas of the greatest confusion. Just I think for the community of researchers and folks who are trying to slog through some of these calculations, it's really easy. It's kind of scary how easy it is to mess up by orders of magnitude the calculations in terms of the final impact, just based on what would, if handled very, very carefully, be pretty simple kind of unit conversion issues. But we're all human, so those kind of mistakes are really, really easy to make. And that's one of the things that we're trying to offload onto Crane as much as possible to handle and document as we go. And there are as many units, more even, as there are technologies, and kind of ways of measuring those technologies in terms of the market update, the market uptake, and everything. So it's pretty open-ended there. Just scrolling forward through this. Oh, and I should also say, I should have said this at the very, very beginning. So I'm in the TAM tab, the total available market, or the total market tab. This is describing this is defining an extreme upper bound. I won't go into all the details about what that means in terms of the mechanics of running one of these analyses, because I actually I do that in some of the other webinars, and I'm happy to chat with anybody off after the call to further clarify that. But that just represents an extreme upper bound of the market and the emissions sort of potential. So this one already has the data points filled out, but within your using the units as defined above, you can further define, further customize, or even delete some of the data points here. If you're doing something from scratch, you'll be putting these in 1 year at a time. If you have 2 data points, it'll make a straight line for you. And there's also options for fit method, which will just run the interpolation in a few different ways. And there's a little bit more of a description around that. So getting the market scale right is essential. And I'll just delete one of these points so you can see the little black dot will disappear. And then of course it's based on the raw data. The line is the same. We use those interpolated values in Crane in order to get the year-over-year estimates. So it's just a conversion thing and kind of annualization thing. And then down here, I'll just linger on this for a second. This is your opportunity to specify for your given technology as you're building it out, the direct and indirect emissions as you define them. So we, in general, I like personally don't like, this was kind of a compromise as we were building out the tool. I don't love the direct and indirect phrasing, because it's so reliant on where you sit in the supply chain for whatever the material is. So I think we'll probably modify that in the future when really, when it pops up in our roadmap. But as it is, this is your spot to describe what you mean by direct or what you mean by indirect in the notes, and then to provide references for the actual emissions values in the appropriate units. These need to be in million metric tons CO2 equivalent, otherwise known as megatons of CO2 equivalent. And it's best as a best practice to include all of the greenhouse gas emissions that you can. This is also a good spot to say what time horizon you're looking at. So for things that have, more extreme near-term global warming potentials like methane, you can specify that directly in your calculations. You could even, if you wanted to, hack this a little bit to split out the methane and the other greenhouse gas emissions if you wanted to, and use it that way. And you get a sense of that as you're messing around with it. One of the really cool features that my colleagues have added is this preview down at the bottom. So I'll really zoom in on one of these. You can see that there's a gray, kind of a dark gray, and then a black dot, as well as the lighter green and then darker green. And that's just making a distinction between the raw data that you're putting in and then the interpolated values. as they kind of show up. So this one's interesting. There's an assumption that the direct emissions, well, here obviously you can see that indirect is treated as 0, so it's not really used. And incidentally, we combine both of them in Crane. At some point in the future, we'll distinguish between the two. But at the moment, this is keeping things in order at the template level. But one of the nice features here is you can see just immediately what the total emissions are as you've seen as a preview. And I was going to say that this one's interesting because it dips down a bit and then starts to creep back up. I'm not sure why in this one, but I'm sure it's supported by the data. This might have something to do with the assumptions around how the technology scales over time. So the emissions intensity may be going down over time, but the total emissions may be going up. And so that's an important thing to account for. So this is all fully customizable. Obviously, you can kind of play around with it to your heart's content. The target market field, as I was mentioning, is a little bit different. We've got a bug. So if you come across this, just so you know, there's a bug in how this is displayed. Sometimes it gets squished, and we're still working on how to fix that. But if you happen to see it, you can just flip through these, and it should reset the view and then show it to you in the right way. But the structure of this one is identical to the TAM or the total market tab. So you can run through here. The only difference is that this is the market and the set of technologies that are addressing that market and the related emissions for that market, for those set of technologies that you expect to displace over time. So in this instance, it's a lithium sulfur battery. The expectation is that it's going to be displacing all light duty vehicle miles traveled, with the exception of the established market of EVs, which is defined in this one. So these should be non-overlapping. That's one thing just to call out. And the total market is going to be a combination of the target market, the established market, if you just define one, that's a low greenhouse gas emission kind of other clean technology that you could be displacing sort of inadvertently, or which you may be improving intentionally, and which has to get, ends up getting baked into the calculation. But these are sub segments of the overall total market. These won't necessarily add up to the total market. There could be additional technologies, which we describe as the remaining market, which your technology isn't expected to kind of address, and it's just accounted for separately as a way of avoiding double counting, and to keep the estimates a little more conservative. So as I said, the structure of this is just the same, and you would interact with it in just the same way, but the intention of this is a little bit different. One other thing I'd say is sometimes the total market just is the target market because there's not a reason to further segment it out, or because you're just really focused on the target market and you don't care to know or need to know the any kind of remaining market sizes or dynamics. You could just make those identical, as you're filling this out. Established market, I'll just touch on this one really quickly. So this one does, you have the opportunity to say whether you do or you do not want an established market. So again, as established market or an established technology is a conventional technology that is probably very likely in the projection scenario or scenario projections that you're using. A good example of this would be EV. EVs as are going to be providing transportation for all of us in the future. Most of these scenarios, if the technology is conventional enough or it's been around long enough, will include those explicitly, and they'll also account for the emissions of those explicitly as well. So the sort of era of saying that renewables and kind of clean technologies are just treat them as 0, that's like in our rear view mirror. For sure. Even clean technologies obviously have a footprint. Well, maybe not so obviously, but they do have a footprint. And so this is a place where you can say, let's recognize that we may be displacing conventional clean technologies that sort of had their time and are going to be kind of supplanted. One of the reasons for including this is just because we don't want to overestimate the ERP. So this is a means of making the ERP the final value in the analysis a little more conservative in its assumptions. So the example here is total EV vehicle miles traveled. And with our lithium sulfur battery sort of enabled vehicles, there's an assumption around what percentage of that established market is going to be displaced by these new vehicles. And in this, you can actually define the units just as you did in the other sections. And then the emissions associated with them, they're going to be lower, obviously, than the target market, or should be. And you can see how that plays out here. And then one other thing here is the default established market cannibalization. We may rephrase this at some point in the future because it's just such a gruesome word, but this is basically saying, it's essentially saying for every one unit of your new technology's kind of market uptake or market penetration, 50% of that is going to displace an already clean technology. So if it were 100%, you would very quickly kind of eat into that established market, potentially underestimating the total ERP. Or if it were 0%, you would really just be saying like you're not going to affect that market at all. You're only going to be displacing very intentionally these other generally ICE internal combustion engine vehicles, for example. You could also just kind of play around with it to make assumptions about how you might improve these technologies, improving the efficiencies and what have you. So I'm getting pretty close to time, so I'll just touch on a couple of these other things fairly quickly. The performance metrics tab, you have the option of either directly entering the greenhouse gas emission intensity that you believe reflects your technology, or our sort of preference in this is that you add a physical performance metric that could be theoretically lab tested, and that you relate that performance metric to the greenhouse gas emission intensity, thereby inferring the greenhouse gas emission intensity of your new technology from the relationship between the new technology's performance metric, the conventional technology's performance metric, and then the conventional technology's greenhouse gas, known greenhouse gas emission intensity. So there's an inference you can do here if you want. This allows you to, make further modifications in the Crane tool for particular ventures. So if you had two ventures that were otherwise selling essentially the same thing, and their claims around the performance metrics, such as fuel efficiency, varied, you could test those separately, but only after you defined the equation relating to greenhouse gas emission intensity for each one of those. So that was a mouthful, and I said it really quickly. I'm happy to go into more detail. The best way of understanding how this works is to play around with it and see what you can come up with here. So you can enter in, fuel efficiency as defined by, in this instance, miles per gallon equivalent. You can define your units here, and then you can enter those metrics, what you expect them to be for the low greenhouse gas emission technology, and then you can do the same for the new one. So you see that the lithium sulfur is assumed to be even cleaner than typical EVs for various reasons, which you can document in this here and in the notes. So that's a good place to put that. And then the thing that gives everybody trouble, and then we're still working on making even more like intuitive and user friendly, is where you actually have to define this relationship. If you're comfortable building out formulas in Excel, you can really think about this just as that. So this will update and show you what the resulting greenhouse gas emission intensity is for your new solution based on your equation. I really love this feature. It's just really cool to see what your assumptions are around each of these variables and how over time, your margin for your new technology over the existing clean tech might not be so good or might be even better. You can also hack this a little bit to not even include, this is just like a super user suggestion. You could put in just, numbers here if you wanted to, or break out part of the greenhouse gas emission intensity. So like kind of compartmentalize it. So that only a component of the resulting new solutions greenhouse gas emission intensity varies based on the performance metric. So you can do all kinds of cool stuff with this here. And this is a simpler example. And then, okay, I'm already over. So I'll just really quickly look at market penetration. I think I'll leave related market for another time because it's probably one of the least used features. The market penetration field is where you can define using, using these three fields, what the shape of the S curve is going to be. This is just a default. So if you don't feel comfortable changing this or you're not sure what effect it's going to have, you could always accept a default or just put in whatever numbers you want, so long as they fall within the kind of rules here. And then you could further modify that as part of the actual app within the main app. So this is just providing you a default. And last thing I'll say is, just to reiterate, the performance metrics and the market penetration, those can be further modified in the app itself for the new solution. So that's just something that you can do with the main tool. So if it's not making sense, or if you'd rather provide that kind of functionality for other use cases, then you can modify this pretty much to your heart's content. Actually, let me touch on sharing rights really quickly, and then I think that'll probably wrap it. And I had one other thing about accessing the models afterwards. So these are set to private by default. If you set it to public, it will appear as a draft in the green kind of draft and in or user submitted green section, which I had showed you at the very beginning for everybody. So feel free to share if and when you're comfortable doing that. You can also invite specific people here. If they're not in the database already, if they're not already users, we'll send an email actually to them to say that you've invited them to join. If they are in, they'll show up right down here and just be added straight away. It's kind of like, I don't know if anybody on the call uses Zotero, but it's kind of a similar approach. Last thing I'll say, and then open it up for questions and closing, is okay. So if I were to, I'm actually going to return to the technology. I don't want to share that. Save this. It would show up. I'll go back. It would show up in the green section. There's one other small bug that we're still working out just in terms of sharing rights. We already fixed it, but we just have to actually push it to production so that everybody has access to it. In a couple of days, you will at most you'll be able to see the draft version that you've just used for further modification, as well as be able to see it here. So if I were to search for the technology that I've just submitted, I didn't actually show you how to submit it. Actually, let me just copy this one really quick. I'll go through here, and then you can save progress. Let me change the name so it doesn't, let me. Okay, so you got to save progress first. But once you do that, assuming the sections are complete, you can submit. And by submitting, again, that ingests it into the Crane database and then makes it available for ERP assessments. So that's kind of how you use it. And if you have any additional questions around the functionality there, or if at any point you run into trouble as you're using it, feel free to send us a message on Slack, and we'll respond as quickly as humanly possible. And if you're really willing to stick around in the app to work through it and are able to share a screen or anything like that, that's very useful information for us. So I'll leave it at that because I'm already 7 minutes over and open up for some questions.
All right, so yeah, we have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone has any, you can submit them in the Q&A, and Amber is also here to answer any questions kind of more technically related. And while people are submitting questions, maybe Seth, you can talk about the related markets tab, since we didn't really get to that.
Sure. Yeah. I can touch on that. Let me just share my screen again. Okay, so let me
I was
open
gonna
this
say,
up.
after that, one other thing that might be helpful is just to show in the category how to turn off the filter for verified, because automatically only verified technologies are going to show up. So if you're looking for your technology, you'll just want to make sure to turn that filter off in the main application.
Verified. Yeah, let me just show this really quick and then we can bounce over to that. That was in sharing rights, right? Let me show you.
Not in sharing rights in the main application.
Oh, whoops. Oh yeah. Okay. Here's a little sort of funny bug. So just really quickly on the related market tab. If there's a market, so this is in some cases called, if you're familiar with the avoided emissions framework, the closest thing to that is in other contexts is basically called secondary enabling effects. And so if there's emission savings, avoided emission savings that you think are going to occur as a consequence of, and probably farther in the future, as a consequence of changes to a different industry or a different market, then you can describe those here. It's like doing, I'll just say yes on this. It's basically like doing another ERP analysis. So you have to fill out, projection scenario. You have to run through and describe things. One example might be, one that I like to give is if you're looking at large scale battery storage, there are arguments out there as well as papers that have been published that say that the real value of large scale grid storage is that it's going to enable renewables to take off. So in this case, the direct emissions or the primary emissions reduction potential for the batteries might not be so big. But if you run through the exercise of laying out how the your technology is going to make the renewable markets grow or demand for that grow, and then have the renewables displace fossil fuel based electricity, then that is captured in Crane as a secondary ERP. But since there aren't really shortcuts in describing that relationship, you've got to do the same thing as elsewhere. You have to fill out market data, put in the emissions, and then also provide an estimate. I don't think I have it here. An estimate around the cross sector, what we call a cross sector growth factor. So for every unit of your new technologies uptake, how much does that mean in terms of an uptake and growth in the related market there. So that was like a really, really quick overview. And I can go into more detail at another point in time, or if after the call folks need to see an example in Crane on what that actually looks like, I'm happy to share that. Okay, so I've got this one. Amber, could you remind me again what we should be
Sure.
showcasing?
If you just pick one of the categories real quick.
There we go.
Go to next. There's filters on the left. So rather than being Crane verified, you'll want to click show all, and that's how you're going to find your private technologies show up.
There we go.
So just
Cool.
as in case you have trouble locating it, that could be one of the
Great.
things.
Yeah, that's a new feature that I hadn't actually seen. Thanks, Amber.
We have a question about how Crane is funded. So I'll let Seth, you can answer this one.
Yeah, so we've been funded primarily through grants. Crane got its start through a grant from the MacArthur Foundation back in end of 2018, and then we started to work in 2019, as well as funding from NYSERDA, the state of New York, and the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, so the Mass CEC. That's definitely a primary way. We also work directly with Prime Coalition to fund build out of some of the new features, including this one, as well as the user study, which Cassie had mentioned earlier. And then we also have, in instances where development of Crane is well aligned with, consulting engagements or customizations that people need, or things like that, then we'll be able to develop develop the tool while working on those projects. A good example of that one, a recent example, is the Mars Discovery District work and project that we worked on with them over the last 5 or so months. So where it works out well, where we were helping them with their assessments and added a bunch of data to Crane for everybody to use. So that's how, but it's there are a few different ways.
And kind of a follow-up question, I'm hoping to estimate the carbon footprint of the R&D portion of a new pharma product. Is this the right tool?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't think we have, did you say pharma, like PHA? Yeah, we don't have any pharma models in like market projections or emission scenarios in Crane, but I don't see any reason why you couldn't. I think it would be great. You'd have to probably you'd almost certainly need to use the custom technology module and put in your own data there and make sure you can clearly define the projection scenario. I haven't come across data on emissions and emissions for those, so that might be a little challenging to get. But since you're asking the question, I'm guessing that you could. You're a lot more well versed in that sector than I am. But I think you could, as long as there are reports out there. I personally have no idea what the emissions, the scale of emissions is for pharma, but I think you could use the tool for that.
And then we have a hand raised by Aaron, so I will let you unmute and ask your question. Or maybe it was just a...
It was an accident, sorry. Thanks.
Oh, okay, no problem. All right, I think that wraps up our questions then. So if you have any other further questions, we posted in the chat, but you can email us at info@cranetool.org. We also have a Slack channel for our users that you can access through our landing page, cranetool.org. If you scroll to the bottom, you'll see a place to put in your email and get an invite. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everybody.